right. So, welcome everyone to this webinar. Just to give you an idea of what we're doing here, this is a combination between the National Immigration Forum and Northwestern College. So we have a new program, what is called Students of Welcome. And my name is Jason Leaf, and I teach at Northwestern in the theology department. And I also work as a Bibles, Badges, and Business mobilizer for the National Immigration Forum. And so one of the things that we've done with this initiative is to try to reach into college campuses, especially Christian college campuses, and raise awareness on issues related to immigration. And so one of the things that we thought about doing was this webinar on climate change and migration. I like to hang out with the scientists. And so I was just kind of brainstorming with a colleague, and we came up with this. But I want to introduce or let Allie introduce herself. So Allie is an intern working. She's a Northwestern College student, and she's also an intern working for the forum. So I'll let her introduce herself, and then we'll just do a quick introduction of the speakers, and then we'll get going. So Allie, go ahead.
Yeah, hello everybody. My name's Allie Oberhoman. I am a political science and Spanish student at Northwestern College. As Dr. Leaf said, I'm interning through the National Immigration Forum this semester, so I'm excited to hear all of your input on this webinar.
All right, good. So I'm going to call on some of you just to introduce yourself as speakers, just very briefly, if you would. And then once we get introductions done, we'll get going, and I'll just go as I see you on the screen. So Chris, if you could just give a short introduction of yourself.
Yeah, my name is Chris Duran. I'm the professor of religion and sustainability here at Pepperdine, and I'm also the founder of our sustainability program.
Good. Steve.
I'm Steve Boma-Prediger. I teach at Hope College in Holland, Michigan. I'm a professor of religion, and I'm one of the co-founders of the Environmental Studies program here at Hope College.
Thank you. Alexandra.
Hi, I'm Alexandra Villarreal. I'm the Senior Policy and Advocacy Associate at the National Immigration Forum, and I'm excited to be here.
Thank you. Moises, can you introduce yourself?
Hola, buenas tardes. Soy Moisés Pérez desde la Ciudad de México. Soy profesor de Biblia en el Seminario Luterano aquí en la ciudad y estoy a cargo de una pastoral de migración que acompaña a las personas que están cruzando por aquí, por México.
My name is Moisés Pérez Espino. He works as a professor in the Lutheran Seminary in Mexico City, and he also works in the migration ministry of the Mexican Lutheran Church, a ministry that helps people that are coming through Mexico.
Awesome, thank you. And Emily, can you hear me? All right.
Hi, I'm Emily Stutzman. I direct the undergraduate Environmental and Sustainability Sciences program at Lipscomb University in Nashville, Tennessee.
All right, thank you. So I sent you guys some of the questions, and Allie and I are going to take turns asking some of these questions. But so initially what we want to do is just kind of set some definitions. So for people who are listening or who maybe watch this a little bit later, the two terms that I think need to be defined are climate change and migration. And I think that will help us as we think about the relationship between them. And so, Emily, I want to start with you as I think technically it says you're a biologist or you're in the biology department, but would you be willing to describe or talk a little bit about what we mean when we use the word climate change?
Sure. What we mean when we talk about climate change are ways that the climate is changing. And so when we're thinking about the climate, what we're really thinking about is moisture. So that's precipitation and temperature, changes in moisture and temperature. So a lot of people think that global warming is synonymous with climate change, though global warming is actually a subset of climate change. And that in some places, what climate change will look like is hotter and wetter. And some places, what climate change will look like is colder and drier. And so the combination of moisture and temperature changes is what we're talking about with climate change. And then we can get more specific when we're talking about human influenced climate change, the way that human actions interact with the climate system that has been relatively stable throughout human history on planet Earth. And specifically, when we're talking about human caused climate change or human influenced climate change, we're talking about the human activities that have changed the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that result in higher temperatures and more variable moisture. And that is a result of primarily industrial activities since the Industrial Revolution.
Okay. And Chris, maybe to follow up on that just a little bit, as we think about communities of faith, climate change can be a little bit controversial, and maybe not just in communities of faith, but as we think about churches and communities of faith, there tends to be this conversation about climate change. Is it real? Is it not real? And so on. Could you speak to that just a little bit? And what might be the hesitancies in certain communities to question the issue of climate change?
Sure. I think it's important to know that a lot of the hesitancy tends to be in American Protestant churches. Roman Catholics and Orthodox folks in America, at least, don't have nearly the problems with this, saying that climate change is verified by the science of the day. And particularly, it's white evangelical churches that have the most problem with this. And Pew Center study after study has shown that white evangelicals tend to have the most skepticism towards science as a whole and climate change within that. I think some of the reasons for that are varied. I mean, depending on location, in the sense of like where you grew up and which church community you may call your home. But you see some things about just the political partisanship that we sort of are finding ourselves in, that identity politics oftentimes is not about gender and race, but is about whether you think science is real or not. And that can be an identity for you, and that can be a frame by which you see the world coming to you. And whether that's what we've seen through like the anti-vax movement or the anti-evolution movement, which was I used to study, to now climate issues, that lots of churches have made it sort of an identity marker to say the science is wrong. And then there's theological problems that some would say that, well, God, if God is sovereign, then this is all under God's sovereignty. But to me, that sort of denies the idea that humans have a lot of responsibility for a lot of things in the scriptural texts, and God oftentimes allows us to sit in our own muck. We call sin quite a lot, and we don't often want to kind of think that part of the story might be true, that we might have a part of this that's our fault. And then, working with my friend Catherine Hale for so many years, I mean, I think a lot of Christians just are overwhelmed, just like a lot of other people around the planet are just overwhelmed to know that if you live in the global north and you would just happen to win the geographic lottery of being born here, your carbon footprint is massive compared to the rest of the world. And that can be an overwhelming thing to kind of come to grips with and understand that even if it's a sin of omission or a sin of ignorance, that you're harming other people and other creatures around the planet. And that can just be hard to grasp and to internalize and then to take responsibility for. There's a ton of other reasons, but those are a handful of things to think about.
Okay. Yeah, good. Thanks. Steve, did you want to pick up on that a little bit? As somebody who's a theologian, or at least you're in the religion department and study philosophy, I think a little bit, but spend a lot of time thinking about climate change. Did you want to add some things to that?
Well, I just experienced the same thing, and speaking in churches and talks, there's a lot of resistance among certain Christian groups. I'm an evangelical. I'm also Reformed tradition, and there are, climate denial is part of the reality of the churches you find around, especially this country, as was indicated, especially evangelical Protestants. And one of the reasons often given is, well, God is in control and is in charge, and we'll just let things go, and God will take care of things. Well, we don't say that for a lot of other things in our lives. I mean, bad things that happen, we try to do something as agents who have control over our lives. And then there's this whole thing called free will that many people would say, okay, God is sovereign, God is omniscient, all-knowing, but that doesn't cancel out the fact that we humans are agents who are held responsible by God and our friends, our family, for the things we do. We're not robots. And so we freely act, and God is in control. And there lies one of the mysteries of the Christian faith for some folks that say, yeah, God is all-powerful and all-knowing and all those other omnis, but that doesn't get us off the hook as humans for trying to act courageously and faithfully in doing the right thing. And that includes when it comes to taking care of our home planet. So we're not off the hook because God is somehow in control.
Sure. Good. Thanks. Moises, I wanted to come to you as well as a pastor, and I think you were in the Lutheran seminary. In what your experience in Mexico, how people understand climate change there.
Bueno, voy a hablar en español y agradezco a Elisa que me traduzca. No sé qué está pasando con mi cámara, una disculpa. Bueno, en México tenemos ya algunos problemas por el cambio climático. Hay un desplazamiento interno del campo a la ciudad, Elisa.
He's sorry because his camera is not working really well. But in Mexico, it's problems right now due to climate change.
Hay un desplazamiento del campo a la ciudad, un desplazamiento interno.
That are migrating internally in Mexico to the rural parts of the country, to the urban parts of the country.
Y me gustaría hablar de dos situaciones específicas.
But just to think about two specific situations.
Una en un estado costero en el océano, en el Golfo de México, que es una pequeña ciudad pesquera que se llama El Bosque.
One is a city that is close to the Gulf of Mexico. It's a city that is close to the ocean, and the name is El Bosque, the forest.
El mar se lo desapareció en octubre-noviembre de 2023.
In 2023, on November and October, due to the increase of the sea, the whole city disappeared.
Tuvieron que mover la ciudad, moverse la gente, y esto provocó migración porque muchos jóvenes salieron de la ciudad pesquera para ir a otras ciudades de México o a los Estados Unidos.
So the people who was living there, they needed to move to another countries, in this case, the United States, and some other people, they move around Mexico.
Y otra cosa de la que quisiera hablar es que el cambio climático no solo es por el uso de combustibles fósiles, también lo provoca la deforestación.
So in Mexico, the climate change is not due to other things, but also the deforestation that exists in the country.
Por ejemplo, para sembrar más aguacate que se consume en los Estados Unidos.
One of the examples also is to plant more avocado that is consumed in the United States.
Han deforestado el estado de Michoacán tirando pinos y un árbol que se llama oyamel.
There is a deforestation in a state called Michoacán that they are cutting the trees, oyamel and other tree.
Para sembrar más aguacate.
So when they deforestate that part of the country, they can plant more avocado.
Que necesita muchísima más agua y que ha impedido que las mariposas monarca que viajaban cada año lleguen porque ya no hay oyamel.
So the avocado needs more water. So they are deforesting the oyamel, the tree. So the butterflies that they used to migrate from Canada, United States, and Mexico, they stopped coming this year. That's other example.
Sure.
Entonces, sí pasa. Y más tarde, si tengo tiempo, me gustaría hablar de lo que hacemos para sensibilizar con la Biblia a la gente para que ayude a las personas que están en migración.
So later in the talking, he want to talk about how the church is doing activities to sensibilize the people in climate change and migration.
Yeah. Thank you.
Gracias.
Yeah, thank you. Allie, you go ahead and talk. We'll switch into the migration side.
Yeah. I think especially when we're talking about the impacts of human impacts on climate change, it's important to just define what we mean by migration. I feel like there's a lot of mix-up of terms, especially when coming to define people who are moving from country to country, place to place. So, Alexandria, would you be able to give us a just a definition of what we mean by migration?
I'd love to. So migration is really just movement, right? And it's one of the through lines of life on Earth. We all know that animals migrate. We're all familiar with how birds migrate every year to go to more hospitable climates. And just like animals migrate, people for, all of history have moved to areas that will better serve them. And today that often means moving within borders or across borders. Migration really exists on a spectrum between, forced and voluntary. And so a lot of us here in the United States may have moved to a different city or a different state for employment opportunities or educational opportunities, but we may also have friends who were forced out of their homes because of hurricanes or because of floods or other natural disasters, right? And so I think it's really important to keep in mind this sort of spectrum that we exist on when we talk about migration. Then when we talk about migration and the nexus between migration and climate change, which I know is a subject of this webinar, there's some important terminologies there as well. So there's this larger subset of environmental migrants who, because of progressive or sudden climate-related events or environmental-related events, decide that it's in their best interest or are forced to move elsewhere within their country or abroad, short-term or long-term. And then within that larger subset of migration, we see what's called climate-affected migration. And that's where folks are moving, not necessarily only because of the effects of climate change, but partially because of the effects of climate change.
Gotcha. So is this effect between just environmental disasters and migration, is this something that we've seen more in recent years, or has it always been a problem, but it's just never gotten the publicity it has?
So we've definitely always seen movement because of environmental disasters, such as floods and hurricanes and all that terrible devastation. But what has changed in recent years is the size of the impact of these environmental or climate related effects and how they are impacting people and communities. And so we are definitely seeing, especially slow onset issues like desertification, erosion, sea level rise that are increasingly placing a great deal of strain on people's lives and forcing people to make the difficult decision to move oftentimes, right? On the flip side of that, though, I think we have to keep in mind that there's a huge caveat here, which is that migration movement takes money. It takes resources and funding, right? And so the last time you moved, right, it is a difficult experience and it's expensive. And oftentimes, environmental disasters, whether they are sudden or slower onset, right, eat up those types of resources. And so, what we are increasingly seeing and will increasingly see is that there is another population of people who don't have the ability to migrate. And what that means is that we're going to have what's called trapped populations who are increasingly in unlivable situations and can't get out. And then, I think we also have to be really, really conscientious that there are people who will make the difficult decision to stay in places that are devastated by climate change because, they want to preserve the cultural, familial, ancestral ties on that land. So this is a really complex conversation. Certainly we are seeing more reasons for people to migrate, but that doesn't mean that we're going to see a ton of people crossing borders because of this.
Yeah. And if I could piggyback off of that very quickly, and then we'll move on to another question. But it's interesting when you look at like refugee status, people talk about climate refugees. But Alexandra, could you speak a little bit as to why that term really doesn't work?
Yeah, there's no such thing legally as a climate refugee. And I think that's such an important distinction because it speaks to the need for solutions, legal solutions to protect those who are fleeing climate-related events. But our definitions, at least here in the United States, around refugee status or asylum are the same. And they are for people who are fleeing persecution based on 5 buckets: race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. And none of those are explicitly climate change, right, or natural disaster. In fact, the US definition used to have natural calamity as one of the potential reasons for refugee status, but that was overwritten in 1980 when we codified our refugee definition that we currently have. And so there is no explicit refugee status based on climate change. Now, there are some really great arguments on why climate affected migration could fall into a particular social group, or a journalist, for example, who's being persecuted because she's writing about climate change in her community should qualify for refugee status or asylum. But that goes sort of into intricacies that not everyone is going to qualify for.
Yeah, good. So let's talk a little bit. Emily, I'm going to come back to you. If we could talk about what are some of the lasting climate impacts that are affecting migration, or that we would see as affecting the migration issue.
Certainly the emergencies that we've discussed already, such as hurricanes, wildfires is an important one to consider. Sea level rise, like has been brought up. So those are as well as water scarcity. When one of the I like the concept of unlivable conditions, and one of the conditions for life is water. And so when water scarcity becomes such a water scarcity as well as food scarcity that's dependent on water, as well as desertification, and like it's already been discussed, some of these are slow and some of these are fast. And another consideration is the internal migration that's happened and has already been happening. I think even considering John Steinbeck's story, The Grapes of Wrath, is taught in climate literature, climate change literature classes as a story of climate migration. The Okies fleeing the Dust Bowl was a story of climate migrants internally in the U.S. So anything from crop failure due to, and again, that is often a slow process. And I appreciate the consideration too of economic migrants, and sometimes climate migrants can be their climate migration reasons can be overshadowed by economic reasons. And that's one of the gifts of teaching where I am right now, is that especially since the pandemic, a number of folks, and you've probably seen the maps, have been leaving areas like states like California and New York, and going to states like Texas, Florida, and Tennessee are main receivers of these internal migrants. And and most of them cite economic reasons, sometimes political reasons for that migration. But once you get talking to people too, you'll often hear these reasons of around water scarcity in California, around wildfires in parts of Oregon, California, New Mexico, etc. So I really appreciate that this is that sometimes climate migrants get masked as migrants for other purposes, when really, and they're often coming with terrible personal experiences, right? Like we've said, that it takes a great deal to move a family or just oneself from one place to another. The pain of staying has to be, or the pain of leaving has to be outweighed by the pain of staying, and that and sometimes these are kind of a slow, repeated issues over time, and sometimes it's a single event. I think that we should look at Hurricane Katrina as a great example of climate migration internally in the U.S. And how the displaced people from Hurricane Katrina, it was an emergency, but their return or not was certainly influenced by future anticipation of climate events that plague the Gulf of Mexico.
Yep. Yeah, and it's interesting. As somebody who's originally from Minnesota, I paid a lot of attention to Minnesota news, and they were talking about the town of Duluth, that with climate change, that Duluth, because of the water that it has access to, is probably going to become a destination that a lot of people, it's going to grow, is really the main point, which it's a beautiful area anyway, but having access to all of that water. So Steve, if you could talk a little bit about what parts of the world are being impacted most by climate change and migration. And Chris, I might come to you with that too a little bit. But as you think about your work in climate change, what parts of the world are being most impacted?
Well, it's a great question, and I'll start by my local community here in southwestern Michigan. We don't have it nearly as bad as many other places, but the weather here has been weird. Just talk to the local folks. Winters where there's very little snow, for example. Very unusual for this part of the world, especially where we are on the west side of the Lower Peninsula of Michigan. Normally we would get lots of snow in the winter, and we've had very light snow. And that's one of the arguments that some people make. Well, after people deny the effects of climate, you just say, well, look around at what's happening with the weather over time in your hometown. But I lived in California for 4 years, and I have friends out there. I was out there visiting a friend earlier this summer, and he was talking about the wildfires that are right near his his town and his college. And then once you go outside the United States, you find examples again of weird weather of all over the world. I teach in New Zealand from time to time, and even the Kiwis are feeling it down in the other half of the globe, south of the equator. So this is a pervasive issue where people are talking about not just weird weather, but weather that is damaging. I mean, killing people. How many people? I was reading New York Times article the other day of people who have died because of the heat just in California, let alone other parts of the world. So there's hardly any place I've read where people are feeling unaffected by the effects of climate. And you mentioned some other effects, whether it's towns that are disappearing because the water is rising on the oceans. So it's a huge issue that I think most people now have some personal experience with. And the question is, what do we do to try to alleviate these problems and make it such that people aren't having their houses washed away or their lives taken?
Yeah. Chris, did you want to jump in here and talk a little bit about as you've done your research and thinking about climate change and so on, what are the different parts of the world being impacted?
Well, I'll start by agreeing with Steve. I mean, there's no part of the world that's not being impacted. I had the luxury of being around the world during my research sabbatical this last year, and I focused on a couple of different places around the equator that are being hit the most, because a lot of the world's civilizations have lived near the equator for so long. So the equatorial belt is probably being hit quicker, or not quicker, it's being hit harder than some other places, even though the Arctic is melting much quicker than some other parts of the planet. There's just not as many people that live in the Arctic Circle as there are around the equator. So you just think about like 3 regions really quickly. I mean, the hundreds of thousands of people per year over the last decade that have attempted to get through the Darien Gap at the border of Panama and get through there. And it used to be, well, it's just Central Americans, but now we know it's Central Americans, it's Haitians, it's Afghanis, it's people from China and others are coming there. And there's almost a tourist industry built in Ecuador to get people through the Darien Gap and up into Mexico and possibly into the US or to Canada. Then you have the Pacific Islands. There's countless but there's lots of islands in the Pacific that have been inhabited for thousands of years that now, due to sea level rise, are impacted by this. And we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. So whether it's like Tuvalu, which is close to New Zealand, or some other places like the Marshall Islands that the U.S. has an interesting relationship with, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people just in those places alone that are going to be moving. And then the third place I looked at in my recent book is deep in the heart of Africa, in Uganda, where Uganda has a very interesting sort of open border, if you will, policy of allowing refugees in and trying to get them adapted and integrated into their culture. But they're in a kind of flood or famine situation. They have very either intense waterfall or they have intense drought, and that is causing millions and millions of Africans in a number of different nations to either go to Uganda or leave Uganda. So I think it's important for us as Christians, especially, to realize that this is not some regional phenomenon, that this is a global phenomenon. It's just a matter of how we want to connect the dots and to see where these things are happening. And I agree with Steve. I often tell my students to start in their own home communities, because there's people moving in their home communities. They just may not know it, because having the privilege of wealth allows us to think about migration a little bit differently than those maybe, in Tuvalu and other places that are having to flee for survival reasons, not because they have the luxury of making educated decisions based on a luxury of wealth. And so I think it's important for us to start at that local level, but to realize that there's pockets around the planet, just because of how many people live in Asia and Africa, that are going to be impacted even more greatly than some other places like North America and South America, where we just don't have the same population centers that we do on other continents.
Sure. Alexander, did you want to pop in on this issue too, about thinking about the global impact, and where are the parts of the world that are being most impacted by this?
Sure. I mean, when I'm thinking about environmental migration, my focus is so often on the human element, you know, and anecdotes from the field that you're able to collect. And so, you know, I think what we see on the macro level is that the individuals who are going to be most affected by climate change are those who are already marginalized, right? So women, children, the elderly, you know, people living in poverty. And one of the greatest tragedies to me about climate affected displacement specifically is that some of those who are most disproportionately affected are folks who have already been displaced once, right? And so when we're talking about people who are living in forced displacement and in diaspora, right, they are oftentimes either in communities that are especially subject to climate change, and that's true even here in the United States, right? People living in flood-prone areas, for example. Or, you know, so often globally, they're in sort of informal settings and settlements that lack basic infrastructures like roads that help protect people during natural disasters, right? And so one of, you know, these facts that keeps me up at night is that, you know, those who have already experienced displacement and the tragedy that is are very likely to continue to affect the worst of climate to experience the worst of climate change again and again.
Yeah, no, thank you. Moises, you've already talked a little bit about the impact on Mexico, and I'm wondering if you would be willing to speak about you know, what is the impact of migration been on Mexico? I mean, I know from a U.S. perspective, we look at the southern border and we talk about immigration and so on. What has been the impact of this kind of migration for people in Mexico, Central America, and so on?
Bueno, somos parte de un corredor que se llama corredor seco en Centroamérica y el sur de México. Esto ha impactado muchísimo la migración. El corredor seco es una zona desértica donde ha dejado de llover, pero cuando llueve, en el ejemplo de los huracanes, pues llueve muchísimo. Perdón, Elisa.
So we are part of, as Mexico, at something that is called like the dry path or the dry way that is part of Central America, and this is a part of the like the geography that is like a desert. So we have a lot of lack or rain, or lack or other things happening right there.
Desde hace muchos años, uno de los países de Centroamérica más impactados por este corredor seco es Honduras, y hemos tenido migración de Honduras constante que usan México para cruzar a los Estados Unidos.
Since a long time ago, one of the countries that has the impact of the lack of rain is Honduras. So in Mexico, we have a lot of people from Honduras that are coming because there is no rain, and that rise another problems as they don't have enough food for the people, so they move to Mexico.
Aunque la causa que cuando platicamos con las personas en migración de por qué salieron no la atribuyen al cambio climático, es muy probable que una causa muy importante sea el cambio climático porque no hay comida, por lo tanto hay pobreza.
When we go to the shelters and speak to the people about the reasons that they migrate, they never say that it's because climate change. They will say that it's because they don't have food, but one of the reasons that they don't have enough food is because the plantations and there's no rain anymore.
Algo muy preocupante es que se calcula que el 14% de la migración de Centroamérica que pasa por México es por el cambio climático.
Something really important is that the recent studies calculate that 14% of the migration that are arriving to Mexico is due to climate change.
Y bueno, como bien dijeron ustedes ya, eso es algo global. Ahora tenemos migración de casi 60 diferentes países.
As you were also speaking and saying, this is something global. So in Mexico right now, we have 60 different nationalities that are coming to the country.
No solo de América Latina, sino también de Asia o de África. Y esto crea muchos problemas porque cuando es de América Latina hablamos español, pero el problema es cuando vienen personas de países tan lejanos que tienen otras lenguas.
There's not only people from South America and Latin America, but also people coming from Africa and Asia. So the people from Latin America, it's really easy to communicate because they speak Spanish. For other countries, other continents, we are having issues of how to communicate with them.
Sure.
La tecnología moderna ayuda, como el Google Translate, pero hay países que hablan idiomas que no están en Google Translate.
So the technology is like really helpful as we have Google Translate, but also there's a lot of different languages that they are not in that program.
Yeah, right.
Por ejemplo, Afganistán.
So in recent years, we have people in Mexico for Afghanistan.
Y no se pueden comunicar las personas con ellos.
So the communication is quite difficult.
Nosotros ayudamos a unas familias de África que no hablaban ni francés ni inglés y fue muy difícil entendernos con ellos.
So we've been helping families from Afghanistan and from other countries in Africa, and it's a problem to communicate with them because they don't speak either English or French in that case.
Yeah.
Gracias.
Yeah, thank you. So what we want to do now is we want to move into the solutions part. And I'm going to ask a question, and then I'm going to give Ali is going to get kind of the final couple of questions here. But and maybe this is too general or broad of a question, so you guys can all veto it and just say you need to come up with a better question. But how should we think about the solution to the issue of climate change and migration? Is it primarily political? Is it economic? How would you begin to try to answer that question? And I don't know who to start with. Well, Chris, why don't you give it a shot first?
Well, I mean, I just wrote a book on this, so I'll just give a shameless plug for that. I mean, I'm a theologian, so I tend to see problems either as moral problems or theological problems, and so it seems like to me that climate migration is one of those problems. It has incredible economic and political and social consequences, but ultimately, I think we have to ask some questions in our churches, both in the global north and in the global south, is do we think that people should have human dignity? And if so, what does that mean politically and economically and otherwise? So people who are fleeing, whether it's through the Darien Gap or across the Pacific Ocean, and are fleeing for survival because of gases that I and others for hundreds of years have put into the air from the global north, I think we have to answer that kind of question from a Christian point of view, at least from our church point of view, is do we believe those people should have dignity to continue to survive and not just survive, but to flourish? So I tend to see it from that as a starting point. And I think, the Imago Dei, the idea of being made in the image of God, is such a powerful model for Christians to share with our non-Christian friends and sisters and brothers, is that human dignity is something that we should not relent on. We should not sort of give up on the fact of that each human is made in the likeness of God and therefore has and a certain role to play in our planet, and we should allow those persons not just to survive but to thrive. And so I start with that. I realize there's incredible political
Sure.
and economic consequences, but I think those things should be thought of. So I'll just one quick example. I mean, I use a lot on the virtue of hospitality in this new book, and that's something Christians were defined for the first 300 or 400 years of Christianity. That sometimes we have lost our way in the last 1600 years of how hospitable are we really. Hospitality is really difficult all the time. It's certainly easier locally than it is globally, but perhaps we're going to need to be inspired to think about local hospitality as well as global hospitality.
Sure. Yeah, good. Steve, did you want to pick up on that at all?
Well, I've been saying inside my head, preach it, brother. I mean, you nailed it. We're all made in God's image. Imago Dei is a central feature of Christian theology, and it doesn't matter where we're from or what language we speak or the color of our skin or gender, race, etc. I mean, we are all made in God's image. If we take that seriously, then we have a lot of work to do to help make the world a better place for all people, whether they're Christian or not. Again, this isn't just for Christian folks. So I think there's a sound biblical and theological tradition here. It's just a matter of are we going to live out what we profess? And when we say that we're called to love not just God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, but love our neighbor and neighbors as ourselves. And I think that's the big challenge we face. We can't just write some people off and say they're not our neighbors because they look different from us or they live somewhere else. We need to take the implication or the second part of the Great Commandment more seriously. And it's a good place to start is with your actual physical neighbors. But we have to remember that it includes more than the people who live next door to us. So preach it.
Good. It's interesting. I get asked all the time how I got involved in immigration work, and I tell them I put up a trampoline in my backyard, and all the neighbor kids came over, and increasingly my neighbor kids are Guatemalan and Mexican. And my neighborhood in the 17 years that I've lived here has changed. So starting with your actual physical neighbor makes sense. Alexandra, how would you answer this question? As somebody who works for the Forum, very politically engaged, where would you start on this issue? Where do you think we need to start?
Yeah, so my perspective tends to be more grounded in the policy. And so I'm looking for how the federal government usually can respond strategically and compassionately to environmental migration and more specifically climate affected migration. And so there's a really interesting idea that's floating around Congress right now around climate visas. And through this idea, we would create a sustainable but real solution for those most at risk based on climate change around the world. There's already a really important legislative framework called the Climate Displaced Persons Act. It was originally introduced in 2019, but in the most recent version, introduced last year, the idea is to have at least 100,000 climate visas for people from around the world affected by climate change who can't reasonably relocate internally within their own borders, and treat them like refugees. And so give them the assistance that refugees resettled in the United States receive. I also think that one of the tools in our toolbox is our existing immigration system through its worker provisions. And so, for instance, if all of those farmers in Central America who have been affected by drought, whose crops are no longer yielding or producing like they used to, could access visas to come to the United States, they would be able to provide for their families, and we would have the incredible benefit of their expertise in industries like the agricultural industry, the food industry here in the US that experience chronic labor shortages. So really, if we were able to figure that out, it would be a win-win for climate affected folks, for the U.S. economy, for Americans in general.
Yeah, good. For the sake of time, because we're going to have you all answer this last question, but I'm going to have Allie is going to ask it because it makes more sense for her to ask this question. But first of all, before she asks this question, I want to thank you for being a part of this. I know this is a complicated issue. I know we can't solve it in, an hour-long webinar, but I think the point is to try to raise awareness, especially as we think about college students, Christian college students, and just trying to help them begin the process of kind of thinking through some of these things. But I'm going to let Allie have the last question.
Yeah. So thinking of people around my age, students in universities, Christian universities and non-Christian universities, what are some practical ways that college students can take action on this issue, or just become more informed on an issue such as migration and climate change? If anyone wants to start.
Yeah, I'll give it a go. I think of two things that I tell my students all the time. One is talk about it. Most of the research shows that the average American talks very little about climate change in their everyday life, even Gen Z members. And so I remind my students all the time that if we talked about the things we care about just as much as we talk about other nonsense, then perhaps we'd have a shift in not just our storytelling, but we'd have a shift in the things that our families and our loved ones would say, oh, Allie really cares about this, so maybe I should think about this a little bit more. But if we don't take the opportunity to talk about it all the time and perhaps annoy our family members, then they're not going to know what we really think is important. And then the second practical thing is starting to connect dots, that we oftentimes think that climate issues are for someone else to deal with. And so one of the ways that I have my students connect the dots is to think about what they're eating, and whether they're eating a climate-friendly diet or not can often be a way to connect dots to how the American food systems are impacting the rest of the world, and what does that means. And it seems kind of esoteric at the start, but when you start connecting the dots about where your food comes from, how many miles it traveled, how much, what the carbon footprint is, it can get you into a conversation about how that's impacting those communities around the world very quickly. And that can lead you to start thinking about why people may be moving or not moving from those places.
Yeah. Thank you, Chris. Steve, would you want to give a shot at this question?
Sure. Well, I'm reminded of Catherine Hayhoe, who many of you probably know, who one of her first pieces of advice is talk about it, exactly what Chris was saying. We can't just leave it be. We need to talk about it in front of friends, relatives, and others, and we need to take action. My students, they can listen to me all day long, but what they really enjoy doing is actually getting out and doing things. We've got a lake cleanup day coming up a week from Saturday, where we trying to pick up trash and make the local lakes and rivers a better place. It's been around for decades here at Hope. Or join what we call the Green Team here, the Campus Sustainability Advisory Committee, and there's a group of students there that run that. And again, it's an organization on campus made up of students with leaders who are about doing things in the local community so that you feel empowered as an agent rather than feeling disempowered because the problem seems so huge, so intractable, and no one seems to be doing anything about it. So I think whatever you can do in your little neck of the woods, find your people, because they're out there, even though it may feel like you're all by yourself. Find some like-minded souls who are earth keepers and who are interested in actually doing something in your local community, and start dreaming about what you can do and start doing things.
Yeah, that's awesome. Alexandria, I was wondering if there was any policy or anything federally that students should be looking at or paying more attention when they're interested in issues, whether it's climate change or immigration.
Yeah, absolutely. There's actually something very tangible that y'all can do. So in the last couple of years, the Biden administration has debuted a number of what they're calling private sponsorship programs. One is the Welcome Corps that allows private citizens to sponsor refugees for resettlement. Another is a program for several different nationalities, including Cubans and Haitians, right, who live in these small island developing states that are especially vulnerable to climate change. And so as students, there's actually something called Welcome Corps on campus that you can create a group of students and you can sponsor a refugee. You can also create a group and engage in this private sponsorship for Cubans and Haitians, right? But when we're talking about these sponsorships, you can actively seek out folks who are in climate vulnerable locations. For Welcome Corps for students, right? Welcome Corps on campus, sorry. You know, you can choose to sponsor someone from a place like Sudan that is experiencing extraordinary political conflict, but also, you know, is having famine because of the intersections between that political conflict and climate change. So you have so much agency right now, and you know, my greatest wish is that everyone who is passionate about this use that agency, form those groups, sponsor those folks, get to know them, and make a real change, get them to safety.
Yes. Dr. Leaf, do you have anything else you want to add?
Well, yeah, let's let Emily, you want to pop in on this question?
Yeah.
Absolutely. So students have the advantage of being in on campus and in classes where they're meeting a bunch of new people all the time. And a number of those students are international students. So talking about climate change and what climate change is looking like in different places where students are from, or maybe their families immigrated from, is a great way to get to know that that topic and in an interpersonal way, with along with building relationships, as well as getting involved in organizations that are involved in immigration issues. So in Tennessee and in Nashville, we have the headquarters of an organization called Tennessee Immigrant and Refugee Rights Coalition, Turk, that does great work with refugee resettlement and immigrant rights. And so when they have events, I'm pumping those events out to students and saying, hey, this is something that, while this might not look like it's a sustainability activity, it absolutely is, because sustainability is global, and climate change is driving and will drive more migration. And the more we can learn to anticipate what the needs of incoming neighbors are, the more we can be positioned to serve them out of that Christian hospitality and welcome.
Good. Yeah, thank you. And Moises, you get the last word of the webinar.
Como esto es un problema global, mi sugerencia es que los estudiantes lean qué está sucediendo en otras partes del mundo, porque es muy probable que eso que suceda con el cambio climático va a afectar en alguna cierta manera a sus propias ciudades.
As this is a global issue, the recommendation for all the students is to read more about what is happening in other parts of the world, because it's pretty that at the end of the day, that all the things that are happening outside the United States will end up affecting the United States or our homes in that case.
Yeah.
Entender que todos somos seres humanos y que nos va a afectar o nos puede afectar. Mientras eso pasa, ayudemos a quienes ya han sido afectados.
And understand that all of us are human beings, and that can affect us in so many ways. And also, in the meantime, we can help the people who are suffering for migration due to climate change.
Muchas gracias. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And thank you to everybody for being a part of this webinar. I'm going to put a little plug in for Northwestern. We are involved in Welcome Corps on campus. And so are looking to bring a student to campus here next fall, and hopefully some of the other colleges that are a part of this will do that, or maybe they are doing that. So what my plan is to do with this webinar is it's been recorded. I'm going to upload it to YouTube. And also for those of you who are listening, I plan to send out an email to all of you that will include a link. And if those of you who have been presenters, if you'd be willing to let me know if you're okay if I include your email, in case anybody has a question that they had that they feel like didn't really get talked about, that way they can follow up with you kind of offline. But for now, thank you so much for being a part of this, and I wish you God's blessing in whatever endeavors you guys are a part of. So thank you, everyone.